Hi, I'm Rasheed Ogunlaru, coach, speaker and author, and I am delighted to be here with another coach, speaker and author, Nick Williams, leadership coach. Nick, I wonder, for anybody who doesn't know you, would you be happy to just introduce yourself in a few words?
Sure. Well, I'm the author of 19 books. I've given talks in various countries across the globe. Been at this for 35 years. But if I were to distill what I feel my purpose is today, it's to help incubate more kind of inspiring leaders who are themselves stewarding ideas into the world. I'm fascinated by the kind of intersection, if you like, of I suppose what we'd call creativity, inspiration, and leadership. So I work with a handful of people in leadership positions who are bringing something new and amazing into the world. That's what the majority of my work is now.
And how does that come about? How do those leaders find you? And what kind of leaders, managers, and so on are the people who seek you out?
Oh, generally, to my surprise, to a large extent, considering how I started off in the world, but CEOs, people that are the kind of the people running their own businesses. So, several of them are kind of multi-million pound businesses. One of them is a multi-billion pound business. But the key for me, it's not so much what the business sector is, it's more what's the orientation of the person leading that business. And, I'd love to touch on this idea of stewarding because shall I touch on it now, or do you want?
Well, I think it's interesting, that thought. I mean, I think it's interesting, that thought. I'm just, as you mentioned it, Nick, I'm just sitting with that word, because I think the first thing that jumps out to me then about stewarding is that, I guess, as a leader, any type of leader, and particularly if people are CEOs, we're there in some way to steward and support or help get that ship to safe harbor. So it is an interesting thing, isn't it, what leadership is? So I wonder if that stewarding is something for us to put on the table, but I wonder if we could touch on something even just before that. I'd love to know, Nick, for you, what is leadership? Because it's something as an industry, back in the day when I first began my career, people talked about management. Nobody really talked about leadership, probably over about the last 20, 25 years, and particularly over the last, 10 or so years, huge rise in talks of leadership. So first of all, Nick, for you, what's leadership to you?
Great question. And what I'm about to say, part of me goes, is this what I believe? And I think it is what I believe. But I think, the best leaders to me are those who have, for want of a better expression, remembered their own magnitude, remembered their own soul, if you like, and who then see as at least part of their job is to help inspire other people to remember how amazing they are. So it's another way I might describe that is the greatest leaders are awakeners. They help people remember who they already are, but they're kind of maybe partly asleep to or fully asleep to.
Oh, that's very powerful. I think that's very powerful. And for me, that really resonates here in this space of Soul Leader, about being an authentic leader, heart-led. And I mean, there's a number of things that you put on the table that I'm very keen to explore, this thing about this awakened leader, and lots of people asleep, and this thing about people recognizing their greatness, because of course in so many organizations people don't, and many of the people, like managers and leaders I work with and so on, many of them really struggle. They don't see their own they don't see their own talents, their own magic, and often a lot of the feedback that we tend to be given is quite negative and so on. So there's a number of things here on the table, and I have not lost sight of that word leadership. Maybe one segue is, you talked about the 19 books. The one perhaps that people know you best for is What You're Born to Do. Could you tell us a little bit about that book and how that book came about, and how perhaps you came into this world of leadership development?
Yeah, well, it's been a heck of an evolution for me. I'm 64 now, and spent the first, 8-10 years of my career selling IT, basically marketing IT, and selling £500,000 computers to banks in the City of London. But I never sensed it was what I was on earth to do. Part of me felt like I did have a bit of a calling. My father, in his spare time, was a lay Methodist preacher, and I always kind of admired his kind of sense of calling. He would preach on a Sunday you know, in a local church. I didn't necessarily kind of agree or listen to what he said, but I loved his sense that he had a calling, and that Sundays was his day to live his calling, if you like. But like a lot of people, I probably thought this whole idea of calling was a bit of romantic nonsense, really. It's a bit of fiction, it's a bit of fantasy. It's not something bankable, if you like. It's not something you can build a life and a career around. But I gradually began, even when I was selling computers, to immerse myself in more of the kind of spiritual, creative fields, as well as the business and leadership fields. And I suppose, you know, if I just cut to the chase today, you know, I guess there's a choice. We either believe we're a random collection of molecules through some evolution of biology and physical whatever, or we could believe that maybe we're a spiritual being, that maybe we are here for a purpose. We're not just a collection of molecules. We're here because we've, in a way, chosen to be here at this time of history with a cargo of gifts to deliver to the world, with a calling etched upon our heart. So I guess there's two ways of looking at it. You know, a lot of the world thinks, well, it's just a material world. I guess on top of that, I would say actually it's a spiritual world. It's an invisible world.
Well, I think this is very powerful. I love what you put on the table here, because isn't it interesting that as you were speaking, I was thinking that what you were saying there still, when it comes to business organizations, might seem quite radical, isn't it? Because often we're in businesses, organizations, sure, we might talk about purpose, but that's a business's purpose. We might talk about vision, but it's the vision of the organization. We might talk about mission, but it's very much the mission of the organization. And often it's very materially and very, very pragmatically and quite ground level. What do people, are people frightened sometimes when you, or shocked when you remind them about these things around perhaps purpose, about why we're here, why they're there as a leader? Do you get that reaction, or you know, do people find that they're thrown a little bit, or
there's a whole mixture of reactions, you know, and that's to some extent where I've kind of needed to grow as a person as well. It's like my job isn't to be liked in a way. My job is to deliver a message, and how that message is received, and I don't mean this in an arrogant way, but in a way it's not my business. My business is to deliver the message. So yeah, some people would say, what a load of nonsense, what a load of crap, you know, that doesn't pay the bills, whatever. And, you know, with the economic crisis, you know, we could go into all sorts of stuff. And if it is true though, it strikes a chord of remembrance for a lot of people. It's like so many people, you know, I've had this experience for me, and now I can do it for other people as well, which is, I kind of always sensed that was true, but nobody ever said it was true, you know. So in a way, you're just validating something I've always sensed, and you're helping me trust that sense that I've always had, that I'm not just a collection of molecules. I'm here, you know, with a purpose, and I'm here with unique gifts. But nobody ever told me that. You know, that's part of the problem, is nobody ever validated that. Nobody tells us at school, you know.
Right. And so I'm just imagining here being a manager, a leader, and hearing what you're saying and thinking, okay, this is very interesting. I know that I'm a leader, I'm a manager, I'm a chief executive, or I'm a senior manager, and that there's a job to be done, and there are goals, and there's people, and there's all this stuff. And now you're reminding me, you're inviting me to think that I've got gifts, I've got talents, I've got a purpose here, and so on. What is your core message to anybody who is out there and they are a leader, and they are a manager? I guess I'm guessing that you partly put that on the table, that you're not just somebody who there has this title of CEO or manager or what have you. There's something deeper that you need to begin to explore. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I guess the kind of core message would be in a way that I think one of the biggest parts of the job description of being a kind of great leader, a soul leader, is to inspire. And in order to kind of do that, you have to go, for me, you not have to go back a step, but there's a step before that, which is, in a way, I think you must be not just committed to, but kind of devoted to, because you love it, your own growth. the shedding of your own sense of limitations, the liberation of your own talent, the liberation of your own gifts. Because, I think you almost touched on it earlier, but so many people see their job as leaders is to control people. The old paradigm of leaders are here to control everybody. What if the leader saw themselves as here to liberate their own talent, to liberate their own potential, to discover their own brilliance and uniqueness, and then see their job as to then draw that out of the people around them too, and be on a kind of journey together where you're all lifted and rising up together. Obviously, not many organizations think that way. But, I do coach several CEOs who are thinking that way, and it's a joy to see what happens. It's not without challenges, it's not without difficulties, but the pleasure they get from their own growth and being the enabler of the growth of other people, it goes beyond whatever material success they create, if you like. It's how they create the success, not just the success they create.
And when people come to you, Nick, is it usually the individuals, the chief executives, those senior staff, those senior leaders themselves, who personally come to you because they realize it's something that they're wanting to do in terms of their own journey, their own development? Or is it an organization that comes to you and says, hey, we've got this senior leader who's wanting to do some development? Can you tell us a little bit about how that tends to typically come about?
How does it come about? I tend to work with the individuals. How they find me, maybe there's a kind of magic and a mystery to that too. How do we find each other? I've very consciously for many years made myself visible. How I've done that is by writing and doing videos and sharing stuff, just for the pleasure of it. And then it triggers things in people, and they kind of go, oh, I'd like to have a conversation with you, or I know somebody that I think should have a conversation with you. So again, I kind of see my job as just to keep showing up. That's the word, the expression I love using. I just show up in lots of different ways, and somehow the connections get made. I often think I should have a more coherent marketing strategy, but most of it comes in ways that I would never have anticipated anyway.
I really understand that. And maybe there's something there. What I'm getting a sense of here is that, perhaps my own experience of these things are, Nick, that when it comes to leadership and management leadership, there's this thing about there's almost this notion that we're here to help this person to develop their skills, their leadership, and so on, and that there's quite a confined, in theory, these are the things that we're going to look at to help them to become a more effective leader, or to do this, or to achieve this X or Y. But I get a sense from your approach, and certainly from mine, that we really need to understand who that person is and what really makes them really, really tick, and why they're here, and for them to understand what the organization is truly about as well, and to see where the alignment is or isn't, in order for us to really go on that journey. I'm curious to know a little bit about what tends to happen when people first sit down with you. Is there this awareness of almost these two paradigms between the very practical goals for them to achieve as a leader for them in their organization, and this searching, or this wanting to be authentically themselves and to perhaps reconnect to purpose? Is that palpable in the room when you're working with people?
It's a great question. I'm just reflecting. I think, well, it really comes back to the stewarding idea. I think the people I am best suited to serve, and who I end up having the conversations with, are people that are bringing something new into the world.
I see.
So, a couple of examples might be, I'll just share a couple of examples. I've worked with her on and off over the years, and we're mates now, but I think I mentioned it to you before, that her name's Liz Trubridge. She's the kind of hands-on executive producer of Downton Abbey, the 6 series of it, and the 2 films so far. So, she works very much, obviously, in collaboration with Julian Fellows, who writes it. So, maybe, can I just give you a slightly bigger context?
No, please.
Just as a bigger context. And again, I'm not saying this is true, but it's how I feel comfortable or less uncomfortable now, kind of imagining the world to be. And the way I imagine the world to be is, there's the physical world, and then there's a realm of consciousness where all ideas already exist in potential. And those ideas are looking for what I call willing human collaborators, people that will make them exist in the world. So I don't know if this is true, but here's my theory, and Liz seems to kind of agree with it in a way. It's like Downton Abbey wanted to exist in the world. It existed on that plane of existence. Julian Fellows kind of got the story. He became the human collaborator to put it on paper. Liz then took it off the paper and made it appear on the screen. So it's this wonderful collaboration with an idea that wants to exist in the world. And most of the leaders that I work with are very consciously aware that they are making something exist in the world that hasn't so far existed. But the wonderful thing about being this kind of idea of a willing human collaborator is it takes a lot of the pressure off you. Because if you think about it, right, an analogy I might use is being a gardener. If you think, oh my God, I'm responsible for making everything grow in the garden, that's a heavy burden. But if you think, oh, that daffodil wants to blossom next spring, that acorn wants to become an oak tree, that's what it wants to become. Let's work together to do what's required for that to become what it can become.
I think that's powerful. Right. Yeah, please.
Yeah, So I think also where I'm kind of growing at the moment is I think we may all kind of recognize that exists in the creative world. You hear Paul McCartney getting Yesterday as a song in a dream and kind of going, where did that come from? I think what we haven't thought so much is that if there is such thing as a muse from this kind of realm of consciousness, she, if you want to call her Rasheed, has got just as many ideas for business and leadership and politics as she has for songs and books and movies.
And that's exactly why
nobody's listening, but if nobody's listening.
Magical. And it's funny, that was exactly why I wanted to take this conversation, because one of the things that strikes me as a coach, and part of my background is as a singer and performer, for me, the thing that I often say that just because I can't see it, it doesn't matter, because one minute I don't have a song, next minute I have a song. So I'm very much from that space, and I'm inspired in that way, because that something will just come to me. It might be similar with books and so on, and as you know, as an author, but that, so in the creative, I can imagine in that creative space, that's very much part of the fabric of how we're inspired and so on. So I'd imagine with the creatives that you work with, and to a degree, I know that you work with some people in sports as well, it will be similar, isn't it? There's a similar kind of inspiration, that possibility sense of, when we think about some of these other areas that you put onto the table, politics and our organizations and businesses, often it seems to be, even though we know lots of business will start with that spark or a creative idea, by the time they've become bigger businesses, often that's dead in the water, isn't it? Or we've lost touch of that. So what would be your message to somebody who's listening to this, Nick, and finding it fascinating to hear and perhaps wants to sit with what you're saying, and perhaps is in a industry that perhaps isn't necessarily as creative, or even if it's a creative industry, not as creative as we perhaps talked about here, or with those leaders who get that. But let's say the person who's in an organization, perhaps a large organization or business, or one whereby it seems to be the classic, command control. You're wondering why you're getting up, the difficult conversation, the politics, all of that stuff to navigate. What would be your message to somebody who's a leader, a manager at any level in those organizations right now, and they're listening to you because you're presenting that there's another kind of a possibility of how we can show up as a leader, whatever level of leadership?
Yeah. So just to take your point for a minute, so say, yes, an organization has become stale or whatever, which is obviously happens a lot. My suggestion is everyone will work on the assumption that you're not going to have to kind of struggle to find what the next chapter might be. Then I would suggest working on the assumption that the next chapter of the evolution of the organization is trying to get your attention. That the next business idea is trying to get you to hear it, rather than you having to come up with it, if you know what I mean. But yes, I think it takes courage. It does take courage.
Right.
It takes vulnerability.
Right.
So, the kind of leaders I work with, part of what I work with them is, as I'm sure you have as a writer, and I have as, writing all these books, and the experiences I've had as a speaker and a coach and whatever, I'm often in places of intense vulnerability. But I know those places of intense vulnerability can often be birthing places too.
Right. I really like what you're saying. Yeah.
I'm not particularly a Christian, but it's like, thy will be done, not my will be done. Those places where we're willing to let go of control, all the stuff, something else can come through then. But whilst we want to be in control, that can't necessarily come through. So yeah, I also heard a quote many years ago by somebody was talking about Leonardo da Vinci, who lived 500-600 years ago, who came up with all these amazing ideas, which we're still trying to understand. And somebody described him as a man who woke up before dawn while everyone else was still asleep. And I think we can often feel a bit like that, even today. It's like we have this brilliant idea and we're kind of going around trying to enthuse everybody else, and they're kind of going, oh, it sounds crap to me, or yeah, it's too risky, whatever, we know what the resistance and the excuses might be. So it does take courage, I think, and boldness to say, I'm going to do this despite my own internal resistance and despite sometimes the resistance of the people around me. It's an incredibly brave and courageous thing to do.
I like what you're saying here, Nick, because there's a few things that are kind of morphing together for me. There's the thing about stewardship, which you put on the table before, and the word that comes to me that's struck me in recent years, which is service, which is service, that we're here to serve. And I think that often in leadership, we forget, isn't it, that bit, that we're actually here to serve the greater good, the public, the organization, the stakeholders, and all that stuff. And I then love that when you also bring this thing about stewardship. Well, what is it that we're what's wanting to come forth here? I just like this notion that perhaps, do you wonder if that, because we still see management still with the hangover of leadership still with the hangover of management, and of course there are things to manage, there's tools, there's time, there's people, there's all sorts of processes to manage. Do you think that that's what gets in the way and constrains this space of being able to just step back and to sense or feel what's wanting to be created, to feel how it is to be
yeah, and even around the idea of stewardship, I see two different types of stewardship, if you like, but I think they're both important. One is that you are only ever the temporary person or team looking after something. And I think, to me, there's always an invitation to humility. This is not about my ego. This is about looking after something, get it into as good a shape as possible, and then passing it on to somebody else. So, a few months ago, when all the politics stuff, was going on recently, part of me went, is there nobody thinking about the long-term good of democracy? It's all about personalities. Is there nobody saying, what does democracy want next? What's the evolution of democracy? So that's one form of stewardship. It's taking care of what already exists. But then for me, there's this other dimension, which is stewarding something into existence in the first place. And I think they're both really important. And I'm fascinated by the idea of stewarding something into existence, where it comes as an idea, as an imagination, as a thought, and then we gradually begin to bring it into existence. Again, I'll just give another quick example of somebody I work with who, basically works in the travel media area. Given the pandemic, when all the flights were grounded, their business fell off a cliff. Their job was publishing in-flight magazines for planes that weren't flying anymore. They went from $100 million business to a nothing business. But Steve had this idea. He'd had it already, but nobody particularly wanted to listen to him when things were going well. But suddenly it was like, what are we going to do? The business is in trouble. So he said, right, let's get this new idea going. I think this new idea wants to exist and whatever. 18 months later, it's already turned over $10 million. It's serving, and it's kind of transforming the way that digital marketing is done. He's taken a deep dive into understanding digital marketing, and is already beginning to, major brands are working with this thing, and it's only 18 months old. But we talk about the idea of, do you feel like you're the steward of this idea, because you're not the source of this idea. And for him, being the steward of it has helped him, if you like, as well as dealing with his team and clients. It's almost like he has a relationship with the idea. So it's almost like I say to him sometimes, what does this idea want next? What's it calling you to be next? And that's, for me, a humility. It's an ongoing conversation. You could be mad in a way. You could just be talking to yourself. I don't know. But if there is an idea that wants to exist, it will lead you. You don't have to figure it all out.
That really does resonate a lot with me. I often think, a while ago, this phrase came to me. I was thinking, I must have been thinking about books and actually maybe music. And what came to me was that I thought, okay, you're the writer, but you're not the author. You're not that sort. And for me, a lot of the time, I have this thing about, okay, being, especially when things are quite complex, just being still and thinking, okay, what feels as though it needs to be done. And I'll often have this thing where I won't turn left or right. It's about just being very, 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 very present. And the number of times I'm coaching people, and it's just about holding that space, because I think with leaders, there's that thing about, for me, I think, Nick, there's a number of things, isn't it? When we're lucky enough, when we're working with leaders, there's so many things, isn't it? There's them, their own life, who they are and what they're about. And that needs to be able to be and breathe for them to express and to see what really, and then that leading in a way which is so true and honest and authentic to their heart and their skills, and that which is wanting to kind of emerge for them. And like you, I get a sense of what, it's been a lot going on, a lot politically. I love that point that you made about, if we were to see that, in politics, that you're here for a while to steward and what does democracy mean, or what's that you're there looking after, that changes the dynamic. As you said before, it takes some of the pressure off, but in a way it makes you very mindful and and serious about what it is that one's doing, and have that humility. Can I just ask, I'll have to ask this as we begin to perhaps wrap up, but Nick, I know I'm going to have to invite you to come back to talk again. I want to, I'd love to know your thoughts on what is it that gets in the way. So we know, okay, if, as with some of your clients, they're the creative and they're in charge, they can work in a very creative way. They can steer their production company, their writing, the film, the what have it, to their particular vision, or whatever it might well be. And the similar perhaps for somebody who's coming from a sporting space, or if somebody is the chief executive or whatever of their own business and they're completely in charge, especially if they're in that kind of creative space, or if they're highly entrepreneurial, we see that. But what is it that in our organizations, as we began to talk about, that perhaps aren't in that space, or even perhaps for a creative business that's lost its way? What is it that gets in the way of us at least considering this particular approach of stewardship, this approach of the greatness of one's own possibility and others around them with that humility? What is it that gets in the way? Is it fear? Is it just the existing paradigm of this is how things done, and that hangover of command and control? Is it that I'm afraid to have a conversation about purpose with my boss, or with the board, or with my team, or to open up these? What do you feel is it that gets in the way from us at least exploring this particular approach to leadership and running our organizations, and letting organizations flourish, and letting businesses grow and evolve?
I suppose my simple answer would be, and it's simple, but it's so all-embracing, is I think it's a reluctance to bring our full humanity to kind of what we're doing, and to the conversations. We have the kind of polite conversations, or the safe conversations, and what comes to mind is that I don't know how long, maybe 10, 12 years ago, I went to an evening where John Major was giving a talk, basically, and at the end of the evening, we could ask him a few questions, and I did want to ask him a question. This was, like, as I say, 10 years ago. I kind of giggled to myself and thought, oh, Prime Minister's question times, only 20 minutes, only 20 years after he's out of office, but better late than never. And my question to him was, how do we make it safe for politicians to be more human and to show their vulnerabilities. Because it's a question that fascinates me. And his answer was, to be honest, give him his credit. He said, I've got no idea. He said, things are getting worse for politicians. They go somewhere and something's happened, and by the time they've arrived, there's a gaggle of journalists saying, what's your opinion on this? What are you going to do about this? They don't even know what they're talking about yet. So, what it helped me see was, both sides of the story in a way. Like, when we're so busy attacking people, they are not going to let down their defenses. So we're caught in this game of like, well, I'm going to throw up my defenses so that you can't get to me. So I think the big question is, how do we make it safe to bring our humanity and our vulnerability to the kind of conversations we need to have? Because I think that in essence is where things fall apart. Is we're trying to do it from an armored place. We're trying to do it from a place of roles. We're not doing it from a place of humanness.
Right. I think that last theme, which I think may be a last one for us to perhaps share some closing thoughts on that. I think it's a beautiful place for us to perhaps to park. I always think the conversation with you, Nick, I always think it's like a conversation to park and to perhaps resume, because I think that's so relevant, and beautifully it takes us to where we are in many organizations. There's the conversation, be it equality, diversity, equity, inclusion, how that people can bring more of themselves, how that the vulnerability, inclusive leadership, it brings all of those kind of themes that are near and present in that whole leadership space to the fore, isn't it? And it requires that humanity. I'll never forget one of the most powerful things I ever saw in leadership was, Nick, it was a leader in an organization, I won't say which. He was a chief executive in an organization, and he was coming to speak to a staff network, and he came and he said, in this meeting we thought was going to be cool because there were challenges in the organization and so on. He walked and he said, we failed you. We failed you because X, Y, and Z, with such humanity. Instantly, the room softened. It was a room I was running a session and facilitating. It softened. Everybody, instead of us and them, the chief executive and this group of staff, there was a togetherness. It was extraordinary. He opened up, he shared a little bit about his own story, his own journey, his own vulnerability, his own thing. And it was profound, Nick. It was all the things that you talked about, and it changed in that moment. So I think you're saying something that is so profound and so self-evident, because our organizations are there to serve, isn't it? They're serving the public, whoever else, and all the people who work in them. We've got to be able to meet each other with humanity. And so
I love it. Yeah. I'm just diving into kind of mindful self-compassion a little bit at the moment. I'm on a course learning about it. And one of the aspects of it apparently is the whole idea of common humanity. That whatever any of us experiences, probably all of us are experiencing it. But we're all pretending we're not.
Well, I think that, I think that's really powerful, because I think that, for me, I think that I was saying that everything boils down to love and compassion in its absence. And I really do genuinely believe that there is something about that power of compassion in that moment, in the workplace, and when people show up with compassion, with that real heart, really caring, because sometimes it requires, doesn't it, parking whatever the business of that day was, or for a moment, how is everyone doing? The team, how is everyone actually doing? How do we feel about it? It's something, and that can be a small one, which we can shift or steward whatever is wanting to, because sometimes it might be something around wellness. It might be something about how we're treating each other, isn't it? It might be something around the way that we don't have room for ideas to be discussed in that team. So I mean, Nick, I want to, just before I invite you to say any closing words that you might want to offer, I want to just, first of all, again, I've said it to you in other spaces before, but I really want to thank you for the work that you do and the way in which you approach it, which really invites us to really look at these things from a different place of real purpose and of possibility. Because I think it makes me think of, it's funny, there's the stuff that you're diving into a moment around compassion. And I know, of course, part of, many people, hopefully, I hope that many people might look you up after this and so on. I know that part of your journey, of course, where you were previously co-directors of Alternatives in Central London, hosting some of the world's top spiritual and conscious speakers and so on. And it makes me think of like when I first was discovered things like mindfulness 20 or 22 years ago and all this stuff, and people like Thich Nhat Hanh, and people who have such a simplicity to what they're saying. And yet when you look, everything's there. Everything's there. So Nick, I just want to say, first of all, thanks so much for the work that you do and the way that you do it and the way that you invite it to be something that can be, rather than daunting, and of course there will be courage and vulnerability, but something that can be looked at gently, you know. So I want to just thank you very much for that. And I wonder, are there any closing thoughts that you might that you want to share, or anything that you've not had a chance to say so far, for anyone here who perhaps I wonder, Nick, is there a message for either those who are at or near the top of an organization? You know, there might be the chief executive, senior executives, and is there a message perhaps for the kind of person who's a leader but they're lower down the food chain and thinking, well, I like what this guy's saying, but I really just don't know how to, where do I start? Could you perhaps offer a message for both sides of leadership?
Yeah, well, I think something would be about kind of trusting yourself and trusting ideas, because obviously when we are beginning or operating at that realm of inspiration and ideas and thoughts come to us, the easiest thing to do is just to dismiss them. You know, no risks taken, no harm done, no looking foolish, you know, everything's avoided. But I think back to my life and think, well, you know, the idea for the work we were born to do as an idea came to me, you know, 25, 27 years ago. I could have just dismissed that, but I somehow chose to follow that idea. And it's been transformative for thousands of people's lives across the planet, as well as my own. So it's something about trusting your inner knowing, whatever level you're at. Yeah, you know, I'm just trying to think of something kind of clever to say.
No, I think that's
struggling a bit.
Well, but I'm wondering, Nick, if that message holds true for both those at the top and those managers who find that trusting of their inner knowing. Because I think that my experience, when one does trust that, it means that we ask the questions, or we check in with ourselves, or we, you know, as so many things can happen from that trusting, that listening. I have a saying that if you listen quietly enough to life, it will whisper its secrets to you. So I think what you're saying is very, very powerful and very, very important to trust that.
So thank you. And this is a word that most people probably wouldn't use around leadership, but I kind of do use it with many of the people I work with, and they love it, is that leadership is an adventure.
I like that.
You know, because generally we want it to be a certainty. Well, I'll do these things and that will happen. It doesn't work like that. Yes. You know, it's always an adventure. And I think what many, you know, going back to what you were asking earlier about, you know, things when they become stale, they've stopped becoming an adventure. And one of the things I loved, you know, I'm sure you know her, many people watching this may not, but there's a woman called Julia Cameron who's written loads of books, and her best known one is The Artist's Way, which is about reclaiming creativity. And then she just had this little line. She said, the human soul thrives on adventure. You know, we need areas of certainty and safety in our life, but we also crave to have adventures. We also crave to go beyond what we know and discover more about ourselves and discover more about the world and what we're capable of. And so kind of access that curiosity, access that sense of adventure, and knowing that sometimes you will make mistakes, you will fail, you will get things wrong, and that's okay. You know, it's not about getting it right all the time.
I really like that. And I think that, Nick, perhaps there might be a conversation for us in the future to perhaps explore this space that you've invited us to consider. Because I think I'll be very interested to explore, well, what happens if we're able to explore life leadership from that place of adventure? What happens when we can step into this sense of stewardship, into this sense of service, and your whole area of the work one's born to do? What might the leader's journey look like? I think that would be lovely to come back for us just to perhaps to talk about. But I want to just say, Nick, I want to just thank you so much for your time here today. If people are looking to find your work or your books, what's the best way for people to find you?
I'm just giggling because I can tell neither of us want this conversation to stop. Really.
I know, yeah, absolutely. But I think there needs to be a part.
That's always a good sign as well, isn't it? When neither of us want to stop the conversation. So thank you.
Yeah, I
Thank
really
you
do
for the
feel the
opportunity.
need to do part two. I really do feel that, because I think that where you point us to, that is a place, and I really thank you, because it is a place that those people who are deep creatives. And when I I love listening to lots of people in sports. One of the sports people I love listening to is Rafael Nadal. When I hear him speak, I mean, the things that he says, often, especially the red times he loses, I mean, the deep wisdom, the humanity, the heart. I think there's so much that we can learn from those spaces of those, the creatives, the artists, not exclusively, of course, and of course from so many fields, but there is something about that possibility that I think is really interesting. The people who are very soulful and inspired in their leadership that we can learn in other workplaces. So I think I'd love to come back to that, Nick. But yeah, I was interrupting. Oh yeah, how can people find you if they want to find you?
So I'm always happy to have a conversation. So nick@iamnickwilliams.com. My website is iamnickwilliams.com. Find me on LinkedIn, probably find me on Twitter and Instagram and all sorts of different places, but mainly on LinkedIn and on my own website.
Well, real pleasure.
Always love to have a conversation. Thank you for the opportunity.
I always enjoy our conversation. I know that we could speak for age, and I'm sure there will be more conversations to come. Nick, I just want to say it's such a pleasure. Thank you so much for doing the work that you do with the people that you do that work with, and for sharing this. I mean, maybe last thing to say, by way of additional thanks to you. For me, with Soul Leader, what I'm really wanting with this area is for a space for, and you've touched on it, for leaders to really to be inspired to reconnect to who it is that they are, and to hear from people like yourself things that will just reconnect them to who they are and their possibility. I have to talk about brushing the dust away from flat. So thank you so much for all of that illumination which you've shared today. It's been really nourishing. I've just thoroughly enjoyed it. I know I could speak to you for another 45 minutes, but I better let you go. And I just thank you very much, and see you soon.
And thank you very much. And thank you for watching and listening as well. Thank you.